The Yemeni army says the Saudi-led military coalition has carried out nearly a dozen incursions into the country over the past week. Army spokesman Yahya Sari said the coalition has also conducted nearly 260 air raids in the same period. He said attacks targeted different parts of the country, including Jaf, Ma'arib, Taiz, and Saada provinces. According to the army, the Saudi-led coalition has conducted nearly 1,070 air raids against the Yemeni people since early April. This years-long Saudi war on Yemen has led to what the UN has described as the worst humanitarian crisis on the planet. Now we're joined out of Bristol for more on the story by Mr. Tony Gosling, investigative journalist. Hello, Tony. Always a pleasure to have you back on Press TV. Now, Tony, you would expect Riyadh to possibly take its foot off the accelerator throughout this pandemic, but we see it doing exactly the opposite. Why do you think so?
Well, the United Nations has also said, just to carry on from your previous report there, that the death toll now in Yemen is, and I think people need to remember these figures because it's a colossal amount of people, 250,000 people now dead in Yemen over several years from the Saudi raids and the Western-supported civil war there. I mean, look, we've got to look at this in perspective. What we've got here, I mean, if you were a war correspondent, Yemen must be one of the most horrific places to go because actually Yemen was for a long, long time part of Saudi Arabia. So effectively, this is a struggle for the control of Saudi Arabia. The Saudis have decided to take the war to the southern part of their country, now called Yemen, which was actually a Marxist state for a long time. And the idea here is that they actually want to subdue many of their own people. That's the reason for that. Is very simple. It's because the Saudi royal family is actually a very fragile system. There's only a handful of people that are actually really in control in Saudi Arabia, and their control on power is not very strong. So what they've done is they've collaborated with the United States, with Britain, and with NATO generally to subdue the southern part of their country in order to really create an internal fight. Now, this has led to what the UN has called the greatest humanitarian crisis in the modern world. And it's not just a crisis, it's, I mean, really cowardly. These 260 airstrikes that we've seen recently are cowardly acts. And I would suggest that actually giving SAM missiles to shoot these aircraft down would be a humanitarian act in itself, would dissuade the Saudis from flying over there. And of course, they're using mostly British aircraft. We had campaigners here in Britain from the campaign against the arms trade, etc., just this week, saying that these weekly essential flights to Saudi Arabia from Warton, RAF base where BAE Systems, the manufacturers of these aircraft, are based, is really taking the mickey, and they should stop, because we're under a lockdown here in the UK still, a little lighter than it was, but this is there is no excuse to be carrying on these so-called essential flights. These are not essential workers. Actually, more people would live and more people would be happier. The world would be lighter, a lighter place. More people would survive if these aircraft flights from the UK to Saudi Arabia would stop. 85,000 now dead with famine and disease. It's about time this war was stopped, and maybe the only way to do that is to start shooting down some of these Saudi aircraft that are coming over into Yemeni airspace. So, I mean, that may sound extreme, but actually this airspace should be controlled by the Yemenis. And we saw what happened in Syria, by the way, when the airspace was started to be denied to the foreign countries, the Western nations particularly. The people on the ground, the mercenaries, and those being supported by the West cannot carry on their civil wars and carry on their attempts at regime change if the skies are actually controlled by the country itself. So I think the Yemenis should, in any way possible, take back control of the skies, air superiority, and actually, gain back control of their own country as a result. And this would be a great humanitarian victory. Even though one or two British planes, might get shot down, there would also be questions in the House of Commons about what are our planes doing, killing these people. So I think that may be one of the only ways to end this horrific crisis. And it's terrible to think that these flights are still going on whilst most of the world is still on lockdown.
And Tony, before we let you go, you also have to ask yourself, once this pandemic comes in, this coronavirus pandemic passes us up and we figure out a way to actually come to terms with it, possibly through vaccine or whatnot, or a possible treatment, then there's going to be, every country on this planet is going to be economically, financially upside down. And almost a lot of critics are already saying that this is probably going to spur the U.S. and possibly the Brits to try to make up for that lost money that they, the losses they've incurred by selling more weapons to countries like Saudi Arabia.
I take your point is that the arms trade is seen to be an easy money because you don't have to suffer the political consequences at home for that trade. And that's one of the reasons I think that the British government, the Ministry of Defence, the Foreign Office have been saying, OK, you can carry on with this trade. But we've got to keep our eyes very, very closely on Yemen because the plague that they've had there, the horrific cholera and dengue fever and other things which have been killing tens of thousands of people there. If we do not sort out the situation in Yemen, we could see many more countries turning into a Yemen-type situation with many people dying of these diseases and, with actually the arms trade, the arms traders actually becoming more powerful, stronger than governments and really holding the whip hand over what our Western governments are doing. So Yemen has got to end and maybe a few surface-to-air missiles might help that to happen.
Always a pleasure to have you on. Thank you for joining us out of Bristol. Tony Gosling, investigative journalist.